Welcome to the Colonial podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Merose Hwang. Merose is an assistant professor of history, as well as the program coordinator of the Asian Studies minor at Hiram University. And importantly for today's podcast, her research has tended to focus around the question of Korean shamans, or the Mudang, and importantly how they survived, how they were changed, how their image was manipulated, and how Koreans still see them through the lens of the colonial period. This is such an interesting topic to look into, because as we will discuss, the idea of shamans tends to come with mental attachments of the ancient, the outdated, the indigenous. And yet within the Korean context, it is also bundled up tightly within the idea of the modern. And it's how these things both come together, how it can be both things at once, that we're going to look at today, as well as how the Korean shaman phenomenon manifested in this period. During the Japanese colonial period, at a time of rapid modernization, and also at a time when this modernization was being sold to the Korean people as something that was necessary, as change that had to come, the Mudang, or the shamans, were being painted as the epitome of what was holding Korean society back. They were antithetical to the idea of a modern nation. They became subjects for study, constantly reported upon inside leading journals and leading newspapers, and always done so through the lens of their gender, because most Korean shamans are female. Essentially, they stood outside what the Japanese were trying to do. They stood outside Japanese institutions, regulations, and laws, and so in a sense represented something unloyal, as well as something unmodern. To counteract this, the Japanese needed a new mental framework, a new strata of propaganda that would change the way that Koreans looked at their own heritage and these shamans. They did this through the battlegrounds of motherhood, trying to change the way that Koreans traditionally understood motherhood, turn it into a science, and by doing so also create a fear of what unscientific methods can do. And in some ways throughout this there is a feminist tinge. The idea of creating the modern woman, stepping into the new world and throwing off old ideas and old traditional roles. But with every positive step in this way, it also came with a large degree of suspicion. Anyone not embracing this would set themselves apart from the larger society and also set themselves in with what was now a new criminal category. And to create this modern semi-feminist ideal, it also looked back on the Mudang in defiantly unfeminist terms, labeling them uneducated, illiterate, ignorant, and fraudsters. And this spread into other aspects such as hygiene, with the Mudang labeled dirty, foul, unclean, unhygienic, and once again placed as diametrically opposed to the modern society in this way. Modern medicine was of course also along for the ride, with the colonial government trying desperately to break the link between the suffering of illness and seeking the counsel of Mudang to try and rectify that illness. And underlying all of this is the economic risk that the Mudang or the shamans represented to the colonial state. They weren't just a source of untapped capital not paying taxation, for example, but they were also seen as an active drain on the economy, with citizens donating money to the shamans for shamanistic rituals and ceremonies, and also stepping away from purpose-built Japanese institutions like the banks in favor of traditional shamanistic financial advice. And this all becomes such a fascinating thought process because it's not just the Japanese doing this. This is often targeted and run by the Koreans themselves despite being under a colonial state and colonial rule. And yet when you look around Korea today, there has been a renaissance of the shamans. They have found their place within society again. And this opens up so many questions for just how this happened and how Koreans look back on this period, or even if they do, all with the important undertone and the important question of how it is impossible to understand modern Korean shamans or the history of Korean shamans, as well as Korean nationalism, without understanding just what happened to the shamans during the colonial period. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider donating to the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Most importantly, though, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And of course, if you have any recommendations for future guests, please feel free to send them to me. On that, and to talk us through Korean shamans in the colonial period, this is Merose Hwang. Merose Hwang, thanks for coming on the Korean podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today we're going to be speaking about a really interesting topic, and something that is quite unique to Korea, even though it may not seem to be from the outside itself. So that is Korean shamanism, or, of course, as it's often referred to as the Mudang. So I might get you to start by, I suppose, distinguishing between Korean shamanism and shamanism as it comes to us from other aspects of the world itself. So there's a wonderful quote here that I have from your early article here, which when you first bumped into Korean shamanism, and I might get that as a first question to build this in. So it quotes, "I was confused and captured by the possibility that Koreans identified with being both modern and indigenous at the same time." So that might be a good introduction to show how Korean shamanism might distinguish itself from the broader movement of worldwide shamanism.
Yeah. In that quote, I was actually thinking about the way that I had thought about shamanism up to that time. So I was an undergraduate student at University of Colorado Boulder. Here I am, 21 years old, and I'm writing my senior thesis, getting ready to graduate with this. And I had just stumbled upon this thing called Korean shamanism. Up to that point, all I knew really was Native American shamanism, and particularly shamanism in the plateau regions around Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. And so that was the only kind of shamanism that I knew. And I knew tangentially about other types of shamanism in Australia and Africa through my religious studies professors at the university. So when I found out there was a Korean shamanism through a classmate of mine, I was really dumbfounded, partially because the way that I had understood shamanism was that it was something that existed as a part of an indigenous population, and they retained this kind of shamanic governance, a kind of shamanic cultural system within a larger kind of colonial apparatus that ruled over them, and that shamanism then acted as a way to maintain the integrity and the actionability of the indigenous population against the larger colonial population, the larger colonial government that was governing over them. So when I thought about Korea, I said to myself, how is it possible then that Korea would have this? So then we are assuming then the indigenous population and the governing population are the same thing. So the government doesn't see itself as a shamanic government. So how is this possible? So really kind of forced me to really rethink the way that I had envisioned what shamanism was about, the functionality of shamanism and its meaning to an indigenous population that then is also self-represented in the governing state. And so the question about being modern and indigenous at the same time is, as I'm thinking back on it now, 20 years later, I'm thinking modern. The South Korean state is modern in the sense that they are recognized as a modern nation by the United Nations and other types of international bodies, governing bodies, but they also claim to be indigenous at the same time, causing the government to, with its, Ministry of Tourism and Culture, to say that we are rooted in traditions like shamanism. And they use that then to say that they are kind of a self-governing sovereign nation that is somehow devoid of any kind of colonial rule, which is entirely different than the situation that we have here in the Americas.
So we should, I suppose, at this point also introduce that term I mentioned at the start, which is the Mudang. So this comes across, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, by the way, but this comes across through all the writings on Korean shamanism. So what exactly does that term mean itself? And does it refer to shamanism only as a female entity, or is it simply the term that is used inside Korea today?
That's a good question. Mudang it's a term that is used in Korea, but the term itself actually comes from a Chinese lexicon. So it's actually Chinese character derived. And so in Chinese it's wutang, and in Korean it's mudang. And basically the characters are, there's been a lot of questions around what the characters mean, but the root derivative of the character is actually based on mu. Lots of questions arise on what mu means and the kind of teleology of mu. But one of the ways that I see what Mu means, and this is going back to the most ancient of Chinese characters, is that it is a person who acts as a vessel between the what do you call it, the natural world and the underworld. And that vessel then connects people. This is very humanistically oriented. That vessel acts as a connector between the natural world and the underworld. That vessel being Mu, that person that acts as that vessel. And so this character, Mu or Wu, was used to describe what we in Korea call as Mudang. But it's also the root word to describe things in historical records like Mugyo, Mugyok, Muin, Munyo, etc. But the word Mu is pretty static. It remains throughout all of these records of these people that are acting as those vessels.
And of course, a lot of what we're going to speak about today is the colonial period itself. Now, of course, this colonial period is a Japanese colonial period. Now, we don't have to get too much into the historical details of that itself. Many listeners will already know that. But it seems like this strange moment when Korean shamans get a new light shone on them in some ways. The Japanese, as they are there, they show in some ways, they make the shamans almost case studies, as you write here. They look at them through an imperial, anthropological, ethnological, folklore studies, this kind of lenses, and they look at them. In some ways, it seems like, of course, in many people's minds, they tend to, not quite correctly, but as make allusions between colonialism and modernization. And of course, in some ways, that's what the Japanese are thinking here. And the Mudang, or the shamans, in some way, must sit as antithetical to that.
Right, exactly. So they are antithetical to that in the sense that they are indigenous. And so this goes back to your original question about modern and indigenous at the same time. During the colonial period, there was no such thing as being able to be both at the same time. In the colonial era, people never thought of those two as being one of the same thing. And so you were either modern or you were indigenous. And in that sense, shamans or Mudang being tagged as being indigenous subjects were the antithesis or the opposite of modern. And so this acts very conveniently for the colonial regime as a vehicle to justify colonialism, to say, look at us, Japanese, we don't practice these indigenous, non-modern things, but look at the Koreans, they do. And by that example, we can say that we are here to lead Korea forward, to make them progress, to make them modern, because we've already transcended those things ourselves. And so Mudang and shamanism is used then as a way to justify colonialism and colonial rule.
So why did the Japanese see them as such a threat in so many ways? So I suppose that's also a question of how widespread and how deeply ingrained were they inside Korean culture and society? Because just from the outside, it may feel like shamans, as you mentioned, as being mediums between people in this world and their ancestors or people in the underworld, so to speak. It may not seem like a significant threat to such a large, powerful modern empire. So why did the Japanese see them as such a threat or something that needed such particular attention?
That's all interesting questions. This question is actually, it speaks to the way that kind of the evolution in my own thinking, in my scholarship, because when I wrote this article, over 10 years ago, I actually did think that they were quite threatening to the colonial government. But as I continued to do this research, I found less and less of that to be the case. During the colonial period, what had happened after the March 1st movement of 1919, which most listeners will probably know about, where there was a kind of anti-colonial insurgence, where people were calling for the liberation and independence of Korea. After that time period, then what happens is the first colonial administration is overhauled. And as a part of the new office, one of the first appointments that is made is to put in a guy by the name of Murayama Chijun, this Japanese colonial officer who had actually been a specialist in sociology in the subfield of criminology, so criminal studies, to work on things like shamanism. And part of his task was to think about what the seeds of insurgency were in Korea, to kind of get into the mindset of Koreans in order to avoid a future kind of kind of mud in the face of Japan. How are we going to make Koreans complacent to the Japanese colonial rule? We can only do that if we understand how Koreans tick. And so Murayama Chijun's task was to figure that out, and one of his methods was to then investigate things, indigenous culture like shamanism. And so in that sense, shamanism was thought of as potentially a kind of, I don't want to curse on your show.
you can,
a
don't
rebel
worry.
Rouser. A rebel rouser. Okay, shit disturber.
Yes.
They were thought of in that way, and that possibly that was the reason that they were so non-complacent to the colonial rule. Never mind that there were, all kinds of atrocities that occurred during the military rule period. But at any rate, the further and further that Murayama's cabinet had gone into studying Korean shamanism, the less and less evidence they could find into the actual seeds of insurgency. And what they found instead was that shamans are really just kind of practicing this kind of antiquated, superstitious practice for country housewives and ignorant rural folk, and that it really doesn't play a big part into colonial politics. And so what ends up happening during the colonial period then is that shamans are kind of treated as museum pieces to kind of understand Korea. And instead of seeing them as a threat, what the Japanese end up doing is that they prop them up as kind of relics of a colonial subject that is needing to be morphed into something more modern. So in some ways, they're more innocuous than one would assume they were.
Well, let's talk about that morph and what the Japanese did to them, because one of the interesting things that comes through this is the focus. Of course, most of the Mudang in Korea are women, and some of the focus that the Japanese take on this is, of course, at women themselves. And reading through your work here, it sings a little bit to, at least my ear, uninitiated to the topic, as almost like the old witch hunts. It's this idea that because most shamans are women, suddenly all women have this implication rung over their heads, and they're all suspects in a way. And the Japanese colonial period, they start talking about the Mudang as, and I quote here, things like young children and young girls, and they talk in these ways like they need to be taught a lesson, and it's all very patriarchal and domineering.
Yeah, the idea that the Mudang were somewhat infantile, and that people who had where their clients were also similarly immature was a prevalent kind of discursive strategy that was used to try to discourage people from participating and patronizing Mudang services. That one important thing to note there is that the Mail Shinbo, which was the colonial organ, it was the daily newspaper that had been taken over from the Daehan Mail Shinbo in 1909, and then as under official colonial rule, then was transformed into the Mail Shinbo, or Mainichi Shimbun in Japanese. That newspaper did not talk about this as much as the indigenous newspapers did. Two biggest ones being the Tonga Ilbo, the East Asia Daily, and the Chosun Mail Shinbo, which is the Korea Daily. These two newspapers talked incessantly about Mudang in this way. So describe Mudang as young children or, as girls that needed to be reprimanded, that needed to be incarcerated or beat or whatever. Those types of discussions were largely done by indigenous journalists, local scholars, and intellectuals that really vehemently detested shamans.
So let's touch on that a little bit deeper there, because of course another aspect of some of your research here is this question of motherhood and the idea of superstition and how shamans affect this, and how this builds up throughout the Japanese period itself. And I'm glad you mentioned the Japanese papers there, because you speak about at the period the idea that every major newspaper in Korea had to hire at least one female journalist. Now, of course, this doesn't last long. They're always fired after 1 year and replaced. So it's not as embedded as it says. But at least in principle, it has the inkling of a type of feminism, or at least I'm not sure if it's just lip service to it, but at least there's a motivation here. Maybe it's just propaganda to motivate. I don't know if the word's right, but like the modern woman, the idea of So I might open that up for us, and we'll walk into that.
Yeah, the feminist movement. I mean, we call it feminist movement now, thinking that we are actually then creating this kind of misnomer about the colonial period. But in actuality, it really was a feminist movement in the 1920s in Korea, and that was a very vibrant movement, particularly among the urban literati of the 1920s and 30s. In that movement, those female journalists were very invested and very serious about and earnestly invested in liberating women. And the way that shamans then figure into that is that they were seen as as inhibitors to women's liberation and women's progress. And another interesting thing to note here is that we would assume that because the shamans had a mostly female clientele, that any kind of feminist movement would latch onto that and say this is a example of women's liberation, women's freedom. But the opposite had occurred, where the female journalists were seeing this as the largest stumbling block to women's progress. And one of the reasons for that is because they saw in women's issues a kind of what I and other scholars have called a middling politics that had kind of been governing Korea in the 1920s and 30s. And the reason for that is because after the March 1st movement of 1919, as Korean publications started to reemerge and presses started to run again, there was a very heavy level of censorship over Korean publications. And so I think the publication bans, like there were these kind of, what do you call them, like bylaws, publication banning bylaws. There were over 200 of those that had been issued during this period of kind of literature renaissance in Korea in the 1920s and 30s. And as a result, so many publications were blacked out or put into an arrest situation and journalists put into temporary holding, that journalists just then started to self-censor. And in that self-censoring process, then they entered into this kind of middling politics where they only wrote about things that they knew were not going to be blacked out, where they knew their presses were going to not have to pay fines and they weren't going to be jailed for these things. And so you see the emergence of a kind of, I don't know, and this is kind of a historical term, but in a kind of neoliberal kind of writing about feminism, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
So the women are just writing about these things that they see as safe, really. It's feminism on the one hand, but feminism that serves the interests of the colonial regime.
So that is interesting, the idea of co-opting feminism in some ways. And it goes back to that, I suppose you mentioned it a few questions ago, the idea that in some ways the Mudang were considered as tricking illiterate or ignorant women out there. And this comes to another thing that the Japanese were trying to do, which was, and as you write here, motherhood was made into a science, and things like home economics becomes a deeply ingrained thing inside the education system. And basically it's an idea that you're trying to separate all aspects of motherhood away from the Mudang. And yet reading your work here, it seems to me that they misunderstood some of the Mudang. Sure, it all sounds very superstitious, but it at least sounds to me like at least part of it is rules of thumb. There are things like sayings like, if two people wash their faces in the same bowl, they will fight. If you play with your grains, you will have an ugly wife. Now, that all sounds quite humorous and superstitious, but you can almost see the rule of thumb in that, as in use clean water to wash your face. Don't unnecessarily contaminate the food. There's almost rules of thumb there, but there's a movement inside the Japanese movement at this time to make motherhood into a science at the time.
Right, absolutely. It's actually a lot of the kind of logic that's used is kind of couched in a scientification of the logic, and I call it sciencey discourse, where they throw in some terms, these new terms that they think are very sciencey, and then use that as a way to say, this is based on research, this is modern, and so these are the reasons that you should do this. While probably chances are that people have been doing those types of practices for a long time, just based on common sense and kind of trial and error. And that was the whole thing. The trial and error, the kind of non-science-based types of homemaking, was then treated as illegitimate, because, and this is one of the, I guess, the more, what do you call it, kind of conspiratorial aspects of this. Is that people, the writers, whether they be feminist journalists or more conservative male journalists, they were trying to push women into patronizing the new Western medical healthcare system that was being instated in Korea, and really that was only treating the interests of those people that had the means to participate in those types of institutions, and that were people that were living close enough to those institutions to actually partake in those services, etc. And so they were really speaking to a very small clientele. And that's the, I guess, kind of the irony behind this, is because they're really talking amongst themselves,
So let's talk about a dichotomy there that comes up as well. So for all the Japanese push to, I suppose, have this modern woman and this I suppose this at least lip service to a feminizing movement here, they also seem quite concerned about the liberalizing effects of the shaman on the women inside society. And there's all these quotes here from, as you mentioned, things like the Chosen Ilbo, and it talks about the trend of ruining chaste women, or the idea that the Mudang were causing liberal feminists to suddenly question the idea or the sanctity of marriage. And they see shamans as a threat to the traditional ideas of both motherhood and marriage.
Yeah, so that aspect is really quite interesting, because in this middling politics, what ends up happening, I think that particular example of kind of ruining women's chastity, in some ways that speaks to, I think, and this is really just a guess because there's no artifactual evidence on this, but my guess is that with the huge turnaround of female journalism and the female journalists within these news printing houses, there was something like 9 months. If you're in one of these printing houses for 9 months as a woman, that was a long term. So the turnover was incredibly great. Women were, either their arms were being twisted into talking about these things in this way, or they were being edited out in this way by the chief editor. To talk about women in this way, because I can't imagine that a lot of the feminist movement literature that was circulating at this time would have been okay with some of this type of thinking. But at any rate, the Chosun Ilbo, which was a fairly conservative newspaper, was really thinking about Mudang wasting the economy of households and like causing marriages to break apart and creating kind of social and familial mayhem. And that was really not just something that was particular to Chosun Ilbo of the 1920s. That was the kind of argument that was made for a really long time. From as long as the Chosun dynasty has been writing about Mudang, that has existed. And so they're really picking up on that theme that Mudang were home wreckers. That they were going to bleed the family dry of their material wealth, and they were going to separate happy households. And so it's a fairly conservative argument that was then reproduced in the 1920s.
Well, let's take a step beyond that particular type of, I suppose, nefarious claim to a much more significant one. And that is the idea across a lot of these writings that the Mudang were blamed for being cannibals and murderers at times. And I suppose it's interesting to look at some of the crime stories, a crime story from 1932, as you report here. And it's the idea that a young child of breastfeeding age was found decapitated on the side of the street. And when they trace it down, they find a adolescent committed the crime, but they eventually wind it back and they say a shaman or someone from the Mudang has done this. They have somehow brainwashed this adolescent into committing this crime, and this is This is part of a much larger trend. The idea that that the Mudang were looked at as, I suppose it goes back to the idea that a lot of the stigma around devil worship as well. The idea that you don't fully understand what they're doing, and they're incredibly dangerous. They can get inside your head and cause all sorts of damage to yourself and to society.
Yeah. I love that story. I guess part of my doing research on shamans for so long, I do have, a fascination with the macabre. So it was a really fun story to kind of wrestle with, and so in the 1929 there was this story about cannibalism, and I'm working kind of. It's on the back burner right now, but on expanding the story of cannibalism and tying it to the Great Depression, because I think it was in some ways connected to this hysteria that people had about society falling apart, society as we know it, all things good, all things that we cherish, have being kind of thrown away because the world as we know it is falling apart. Not sadly, not unfamiliar to us now in the post recession period that we're facing right now. But in that, so one of my arguments is that in these times of great economic hardships, there are these kind of fantastic stories about Mudang. And I've talked to, I'm friends with a lot of anthropologists, and I talked to some of them about this, about whether or not women actually, these manchin that we call them, that's a respectful term for shamans in Korea. Do manchin actually participate in selling human parts or killing babies and, using their brains for serving their clients mental illnesses? Does this actually happen? That was one of the questions I actually wanted to figure out. And the answers to that, there were some somewhat ambiguous, but some of the answers that came back to me were that historically these were not impossible to have happened. But probably more likely what had happened were that symbolically those things had happened. So what that tells me then in my kind of, my ethnological, historical scholarship, background, what that tells me is that in a kind of primitive historical form, that these things probably did occur on a somewhat routine basis. But then as time progressed with state societies developing and other types of social regulatory programs that were extended into the population, that those types of rituals then were transformed into more symbolic rituals, where you might or might not have had active subjects participating in them, or they could have been, anthropomorphic objects that then represented those things that they were trying to put in place of the actual thing that was supposed to happen. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does actually. It's actually quite a fascinating thought process there.
Yeah.
And of course, today the shamans still exist in Korea, and they often do things like the idea of sacrificing animals still happens. So you can imagine winding far enough back in history, and the idea of human sacrifices and all the like is not uncommon, I suppose, in most societies. So yes.
Yeah. So I think that something like that must have happened, in the prehistorical period. But what people got caught up with in the 1920s was that legend of the shaman. Because, one of the things that goes unsaid at the end of this criminal investigation is that there was nothing to really stick to the shaman that she had actually conducted these killings. Her husband had died. He was beheaded, and they couldn't figure out why. And there was another child that had also been beheaded around the same time. They couldn't figure out why, but the shaman was in jail. And so 조선일보, 동아일보, all of the other major newspapers in Korea basically just dropped the story. They didn't care about it anymore. They were just like, we're satisfied as long as the shaman is in jail, society is at peace, and we're all safe. This was the idea. And so it really kind of reproduces the idea that, the hysteria around shamans' possibility of shamans being cannibalistic, that is something that society can control through heavy kind of neighborhood monitoring and through kind of police, vigilance. And as long as that happens, then we'll be able to keep those inclinations at bay.
Again, for me, it has that hysteria of a witch hunt almost. The idea that, you don't need to pin too many actual facts in the right direction as long as you have someone that you're fearful of at the end of the path, and it doesn't really matter how much the evidence links together or not.
Absolutely, and in this whole story, the kind of tragedy is that the shaman herself, there was no habeas corpus. She did not have any ability to self-represent.
And I'm assuming she was executed after this?
There is no actual, I haven't been able to find any evidence to what had happened in the trial or afterwards. But what I suspect is that it was thrown out of court. That the colonial government then would have thrown it out of court for lack of evidence or for whatever reason. And because of that this was not, there was no follow-up writing on this. And so
okay.
The agenda for 조선일보, 동아일보 was to really implicate the crime on the shaman. And if they couldn't do that, then it wasn't noteworthy.
Yes. Okay, I see. Let's push on to another aspect of shamanism, which of course is really deeply ingrained inside Korean culture and was one that the Japanese were trying to weed out, so to speak. And that's the idea of birthing customs. And this is, again, this is a time when the colonial government is trying to bring a new modernization around birthing ideas and education and science and hospitals and medicine, etc. And yet it's a period where Koreans, in some ways, when they're having complications with a pregnancy, for example, they would visit a shaman. So I might yet open up that aspect of this, the idea that birth and birth-in particular is one of those areas where shamans have had such a strong hold in Korean, at least traditional Korean life.
Yeah, that has been a really important part. I don't think that is as much of a part of Korean shamanic services today, but certainly during the colonial period, that was a major aspect of Mudang services. And it was an Achilles heel for these home economics proponents, partially because beginning in the 1930s, there was the kind of global eugenics movement had really kind of started to ride this wave in Korea. And the Korean population was feverishly dwindling, and it was a cause for concern for the Japanese colonial government because Korean population was the largest colonial population that they had, and the closest large populations they had to China. And so if they were going to then proceed with their full-on onslaught into the Chinese mainland, they needed the Korean population to do this. And how would they do that if there was if we didn't have enough soldiers to participate in that campaign? So the eugenics movement then really took on this idea of how to create a very healthy population in Korea. And they saw Mudang again as a stumbling block because they said that these types of kind of traditional birth laboring practitioners were causing more harm than good, that they were causing people to die, women to die at childbirth for failed birth to occur. And so they really took this on. And so the Chosunilbo, then I write about an editorial that they give to describe what happens when women enter into these types of birthing practices. And what's going on here is the writer is actually talking about this in kind of a fantastical way. So it's not actual reporting. It's not reportage. It's actually kind of creative writing where they're just kind of laying out a typical scene of when a shaman enters into a birthing chamber, what happens to the family, and then what happens to the mother. And it's not talking about an actual incident that had occurred, but it reads almost as if this is something that is happening today. And again, that is being done, that kind of license, that creative license is being used as a way to then compel the readers to take action against the shamans. The shamans themselves were very instrumental in birthing practices in the early 20th century, from everything from actually acting as midwives to acting as what do you call them, like medicine prescribers, acting as liaisons to herbalists that were involved in the postnatal care for women, and that did everything from bringing in fortune tellers to talk about the names of the children, to courtesans and other type of traditional artists to entertain the families in celebration of the new birth, etc. They were involved in almost every aspect of the birthing process, from the most tragic aspects to the most celebratory aspects of birthing. And the people who had the means to partake in the shamanic services did use them to a great extent for women's birthing care.
So that's an interesting point there, and something that rolls into, I suppose, my next question, which it comes to that idea that the Japanese see in the Koreans and, I suppose, motherhood in this way as a resource that they need to mobilize and keep strong, and something that they need to make use of in their own in their own colonial endeavors and future wars, etc. And this comes to another question here, which is the idea of epidemics, which were, of course, things like smallpox and dysentery at the time. And the Japanese were having a hell of a time, it seemed, trying to quarantine people at this period, because, again, when such a illness would come across, they would be doing things like sneaking out of hospitals or even sneaking shamans into the hospitals to conduct rituals themselves.
Yeah. And then there's a very tragic part of the colonial history is what happened in these isolation hospitals, these quarantine hospitals, as smallpox and other types of epidemics were taken over in throughout East Asia, actually, in Japan and also in Korea. One of the things that people don't really talk about as much is how much these epidemics were carrying over from Japan into Korea. The tragedy there was that the newspapers, these conservative newspapers like the Chosunilbo, even they were beginning to acknowledge the fact that this was a losing battle and that the colonial government was failing. And it really wasn't anything to do with the shamans themselves, although they were still in disdain of shamans entering into these hospitals to try to take care of these people. But these poor suckers that were in these hospitals, I mean, they were basically death camps. because they didn't have proper facilities. They had no sanitation. Those, any kind of penicillin or kind of medicines, kind of first aid medicine, they took them to the Western hospitals that Koreans were not allowed to enter. The Western hospitals that only Japanese and Westerners were able to enter that had those medicines, those first aid medicines. And so when you entered into the isolation hospital, you were basically left to die. And the chances of you dying from something as simple as diarrhea were quite high because you were surrounded by these people who had all kinds of other illnesses that you were most likely to attract. And so it was very well known during the colonial period that if you entered into an isolation hospital that you would die. And so the story that I believe it's Chosun Ilbo writes about is about a shaman who's entering into one of these isolation hospitals when they see a young girl who is in there because of dysentery. And they call in a shaman because they don't see any way of getting her out of there. And the shaman, does these rituals. And the newspaper is kind of scoffing the hospitals for saying, like, okay, you guys have really, at this point, you guys don't care who enters the hospital or not. That the shaman is coming in there trying to take care of these patients instead of a doctor is something that you guys are not even thinking about. And so we're just going to throw up our arms and say, this is a useless cause. And, it really was. It was at that point that I think the Chosun Ilbo and other papers were saying that the colonial government had failed the colonial population.
So that comes to a question as well. It seems, at least through some of your research here, that one of the great concerns the Japanese had wasn't the fact that they had more scientific methods or the fact that the shamans were less scientific methods, but it was more, at least in part, an idea that the shamans were unregulated and uninstitutionalized. And it would, in some ways, the risk the shamans presented, at least I suppose even in this medical sense, was the fact that they sat outside the formal systems, and Japan was really trying to impose a universal idea across the whole country. And the shamans were practicing and living and encouraging other people to do so in a way that stood beyond that.
Yeah, so the colonial government believed that the Mudang were a nuisance. At the same time, they saw them as somewhat of a convenience for their justifying their rule. But it was really the indigenous kind of nationalist intelligentsia that had a problem with shamans. And it's, I think part of that is because the indigenous population had seen how well the Japanese had succeeded in kind of presenting themselves as a modern state, as a modern nation, and using all of the cachet and the accoutrements of modernity to win over the international population and to take over these formerly sovereign states like Korea. And so the indigenous population saw that modernity was the way to go, whatever that meant, whatever that looked like. And part of that was to say people like shamans, and it wasn't just shamans. There were people like, the fortune tellers, the geomancers, the courtesans, the kiseng. Any of these people that did not look like they were a part of a modern society, they should all be eliminated. And if we did that, then we would have a modern nation, and perhaps we would be able to regain our sovereignty. So that was really the most pressing issue. And it was a pressing issue ultimately more for the indigenous Korean intellectual population than it was for the Japanese colonial government.
So let's touch on that question of the I suppose that disconnect between this modern Japanese and this modern Korean society and the shamans, and I suppose the failure to understand the shamans in some way despite their traditional history here. And there's a wonderful little anecdote here that comes in through your research through the Christian Journal, and it's the moment where they discover a shaman who's been keeping 2 Bibles in her toilet stall, and of course this is quite outrageous, and many people see this as desecrating the holy book and things like it's sacrilegious and contaminated and all these sorts of things. And then you write at the end here that it's just a complete or could be just a complete misunderstanding, that from the Mudang's perspective, the toilet stool was in fact a dangerous place where powerful spirits often come through or in fact reside, and those for that they were deliberately placed there as spiritual protections in some way.
Yeah. I'm sorry, so what was your question about that?
Well, I was just thinking that interesting idea between the modern world not fully understanding the shamans themselves, and that idea that not just what the shamans were doing was considered a problem, but in some ways they themselves were considered dirty, unhygienic, unclean. They were seen as embodying that I suppose that unhealthy, unclean aspect of the world.
Yeah. So they definitely were seen as kind of, for the longest time, since the first Christian missionaries had entered into Korea, they were seen as, devil worshippers and the antithesis to Christianity. And, the mistake here then, as you were mentioning, was that the idea they go into the toilet to kind of convene, hold an office with the shit gods or whatever. That was completely a misconstrued idea. And you're right. They were going in there probably because a lot of the worst things that happened to a human body happened in the toilet. And that was a kind of an indigenous idea that had completely been misunderstood by Christian observers. And it's interesting because the Christian discourse on shamans then also pervades the modernization discourse on shamans. So most of these writers, whether they are Christian or not, they start to speak in a kind of Christianese, if you will, to lambast the shamans and the shamanic movement. Because they believe that if they do that, somehow they are representing themselves as modern, and that they will be buffered from the worst of the colonial censors.
So let's bring this back to a broader picture here. And one of the really fascinating parts about this colonial period and the Mudang themselves, and that's the idea that one of the great hostilities that the Japanese had towards them was the idea that they were harmful to the national economy in some ways. They were a source of untapped capital, not just the fact that they weren't paying taxation, of course, but also the much broader aspect that when women in villages, for example, wanted loans or wanted advice on what they should do, instead of going to institutions that the government was setting up, they were going to shamans for business advice. And also, but of course, it does come back to that broader aspect that a lot of money, and of course, you write this in your research here, there's these people making note of the amount of money that is being wasted, not just on paying shamans, but on shamans not paying taxes and people taking advice from shamans, example. So let's open up that idea there that the shamans were seen as a drain on the national economy.
Yeah, that was a huge one. And that line of thinking has pervaded again from, as early as like the 16th century into the 20th century. That is a very old argument that's made against the shamans. The circulation rotating credit system that you had mentioned was a particularly important kind of sticking point for the colonial government, partially because the government had tried to centralize financial banking systems and to create a personal banking system that then, the entire colonial population would invest in, which was largely unsuccessful in the colonial period, like so many other things were. But the CAN movement, the CAN, which is like a rotating credit system, that had gone on for hundreds of years. And the CAN system, during the colonial period particularly, although it existed prior to this, some, like Martina Deutler, who has since passed away, and we're at a great loss because of that. But she wrote a lot about this in the late Tozo period. The CAN system was a rotating system that had existed largely, I should say it had kind of entered a renaissance in the late Joseon period, in the 1700s onward, partially because the Joseon government decided they were going to try to centralize financial banking systems along patriarchal family lines. And so women kind of fell under the radar in this system. And the Japanese colonial government, like they were wont to do for a lot of other policies, followed a lot of the Joseon policies, although they, kind of purported that they were inventing these things. One of the things that they were trying to do is also centralize the system, and they noticed the case system that had kind of trickled on from the Joseon period onward. Case system was not taxed. It was not centrally regulated. It certainly accrued an interest rate that was not regulated, and involved participants that were not, systematically profiled, etc. And so the colonial government was quite concerned about this. And one of their concerns, and this involved shamans, is that shamans were at the center of these K systems. So, basically, the argument that is being made here, and this is, the Mayor Shimbo is participating in this as well. So the Japanese colonial organ is really interested in this. They're saying that Mudang are participating in money laundering, that they're taking money particularly from the ignorant, illiterate country housewives, and they're lining their pockets with this money from these, poor, ignorant, stupid women, and they're just, kind of living the high life, while women are suffering, women and their families are suffering, because they, most women don't understand how circulating capital works, rotating credit systems, how they work. And so that was the argument that was being made, and that was being made across the board, that Mudang were participating in money laundering. And, it was everything from the K system to venture capitalist systems to, taking money from Buddhist temples. There's all kinds of accusations about Mudang stealing money. And that was a primary interest, again, that had trickled down from the late Joseon period onward.
So that is an interesting question there, that idea that they're seen as such a potential threat to the nation, at least in that economic realm. It's such I suppose, a weakening aspect here, which begs the question, how severe was the crackdown on the Mudang themselves? Because you write in some interesting ways here that there was it wasn't just a cultural pushback. There was also, they were criminalized in many ways. But there's also this very interesting thing you write down here, which says, despite many being fined, beaten, or incarcerated, some were made to officially represent the Korean race. So it seems at least that some were selected, particularly for who they were, to represent the broader Korean race, and the rest were, I suppose, pushed to the fringes and criminalized.
Yeah. I guess if we use the Edward Said theory about Orientalism here, or I should say post-Saidism, this is kind of showing a kind of self-orientalizing process that Koreans had, where they were really showing how, barbaric their own race was.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just kind of really kind of feeding into the hand of the colonial government, that kind of argument. But that was such a pervasive comment that was made against Mudang and people that participated in that. But Mudang were largely incarcerated, and there's a Korean Shamanism journal that has been circulating out of the National Folklore Museum, and they've created some really important surveys of the numbers of incarceration and the different types of criminal counts that had been made against shamans throughout the colonial period. And there were quite a few that were incarcerated for these types of things. Now, whether or not, again, they were fairly represented is a question that we really need to research and investigate. But certainly they were incarcerated. So it was, incarceration before any kind of proper trial was conducted. And I'm not sure how they were treated once they were in there, but that was a real thing, and it was quite dangerous to practice being a shaman during the colonial period. Most of those things were done through the colonial police, and another important thing to note is that the colonial police was almost entirely staffed by Koreans.
So that is a very interesting point, because my next question was going to be what happened at the end of the colonial period. So it seems a lot of that we've been talking about, of course, the mention of the colonial period has this at least implication in people's minds that the Japanese imposed this upon Koreans. But as you mentioned, a lot of the police were Koreans themselves, and you're right that when the colonial period was over, of course, at the end of the Second World War, with the defeat of the Japanese, you say that the animosity towards the Mudang continued even after Korea's liberation.
Yeah. I mean, I should probably temper what I just said by also stressing that the upper administration was almost entirely Japanese, and so that very few Koreans actually held offices in larger echelons of the Japanese colonial government general offices and the colonial office. And so that made a huge difference. And by the later part of the colonial period, we see at least 1.5 generations of Koreans that had been raised almost entirely under the Japanese colonial administration. And so they only know this kind of life, this world of Japanese empire. And so, that's something to note. But, one of the I guess the great tragedies is not understanding this history, not understanding that where the kind of negative approaches to understanding shamanism, that how much of that is actually a product of the colonial legacy. And if we don't understand the colonial legacy behind ostracizing shamanism and ostracizing shamans, then we won't understand how to overcome colonialism. And that's, I guess, the argument that I was trying to make in that article about the Mudang. Because even today, we have books being published that talk about how shamans are, they're thieving and they're criminal or they're superstitious, and, how they're irrational, and how they are, uneducated and uncivilized, etc., etc. So much of that still pervades in the literature and in the kind of journalistic approaches to looking at shamans today, while we still have the 무형 문화재, the intangible cultural asset system. We still have this kind of popular discourse of shamans in this way in Korea that really makes me think that we haven't overcome these things, and partially because we haven't understood that the agents behind the ostracization were largely Korean. If we understood that and we saw that and we really analyzed that, then perhaps we would be able to criticize the way that we think about what we think are valuable and essential to our society today.
So that is, yeah, that is actually quite interesting, and it leads into a couple of very interesting final questions here, which of course the first one comes with that idea that Koreans were largely involved in this, and that you cannot understand where shamans are today without understanding the colonial period itself. It really does beg the question of what did happen, because as you mentioned, there is still a lot of stigma out there. But also around Korea, there's also been a certain rehabilitation of shamans. They are seen as the primordial mother of the nation. And you write interestingly that you say the current celebration of the Mudang reveals the amnesia of the early colonial project. So do you still see it that way, that Koreans are glorifying, or I suppose refinding their roots in Korean shamanism through amnesia of what they did during the colonial period?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. I'm writing my newest research is on the Cold War legacies of the legacies of Cold War massacres and the shamanic intervention and restoration of community post massacre. And so this is a very contemporary project. And in that research, I am seeing the same kinds of very disturbing ongoing traces of colonial bigotry pervading a lot of the way that we think about shamanism.
So as a last question here, and this comes directly from your research, and it's in the last page, and it's almost like an afterthought on what happened during the period, and I found it really quite interesting. And that, again, is that question of what Koreans did and how Koreans see the period now. And you speak about how they began to otherize their own indigenousness and their own indigenous traditions in this way and make the other of them. And you write that perhaps they lambasted the Mudang in order to overcome themselves. And that is the idea that to change so dramatically, to become modern in all the ways that was forced upon them or they chose themselves, that perhaps the Mudang may have become this, the word's it's not quite the right word, but a necessary evil, a necessary enemy that they chose that represented all the things in the past that they wanted to get rid of. And in some ways, when attacking the Mudang, they were simply attacking themselves so that they could become something else entirely, something so dramatically changed from their own history.
Yeah. I mean, it's not to say that all Koreans were in self-denial, that they were trying to deny that they had these shamanic legacies. I mean, I would imagine that there were, during the colonial period, that there were some intellectuals that really had no contact with shamans, that they might have heard things through hearsay because that was kind of unavoidable, but they themselves had no direct contact with shamans. That was perhaps a pretty likely possibility, but that they were trying to get rid of shamans entirely, knowing that they were some part of Korean history, they were some part of Korean culture, and maybe even Korean indigeneity, really was, I think, a way to kind of reinvent who they saw as themselves, as their Korea. And all of those things were really up in the air because, I mean, essentially, Korea was no longer. There was no Korea. You know, as Alexis Studden had said in her book, Korea was illegal. There was no such thing as Korea. You couldn't even mention Korea in discussions as a nation. You know, that would really throw you in jail. It would put you in a lot of trouble. So there was no such thing as Korea at that time. And so it opened up the possibility that perhaps you could kind of scrub out all of those things that you thought the modern nations thought were nasty about yourself and make yourself into this thing that was uber modern, that was uber progressive, and futuristic and lacking of any traces of things like shamanism, and things like, indigenous credit systems and, Chinese medicine and all of these things that were seen as superstitious and backwards and folkloric, that you could make yourself into anything that would be seen as a kind of new and future world. And I think that a lot of these nationalists, these cultural nationalists, saw that possibility to become this nation, not just amongst their own, private, this tiny little elite circle, but among a country where they could kind of lead the way to create this homogeneously futuristic nation. And so I thought that a lot of these indigenous intellectuals really saw that potential, really hoped for that potential. Because what do they have to lose? They had lost everything already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is a wonderfully thoughtful point to leave this on here. Below the podcast, I'm going to link the articles that I use for research here. Of course, didn't get through most of them. There's a lot more detail in there, so I encourage listeners to go and read them for themselves. And as Merose has said a couple of times, it got me interested. Mention a couple of your future articles or future pieces of research that you're working on. I'm interested just from hearing it, and I will keep my ears out, and I hope listeners do too. On that, Merose Hwang, thanks for coming on the Korean podcast.
This is delightful. Thank you, Jed.